Albert Speer was born on March 19, 1905, in the city of Mannheim, Germany, into a wealthy upper-middle-class family. His father and grandfather were both successful architects, and from an early age it seemed clear that Albert would follow the same path. Unlike many who would later rise within the Nazi regime, he was not a man shaped by poverty, resentment, or political violence. His childhood was comfortable, cultured, and privileged. He grew up in large homes, received private tutoring, and was given every advantage of education and stability. In personality, he was reserved, intelligent, and distant. He lacked the charisma of a politician or the fiery energy of a revolutionary. Instead, he was precise, disciplined, and deeply committed to the art of architecture. As a young man, Speer pursued his studies in architecture at several technical universities, moving from Karlsruhe to Munich and finally to Berlin, where he became a pupil of Heinrich Tessenow, a respected architect known for his clean, classical designs. Tessenow was quiet, thoughtful, and exacting. He passed on to his students a love for proportion, balance, and monumental simplicity. Speer absorbed these lessons and imagined for himself a future of designing homes, civic buildings, and perhaps one day something grander. At this stage, politics barely touched him. Germany in the 1920s was a place of turmoil, economic crisis, political battles, the lingering pain of defeat in World War I. But for Albert Speer, all of that remained background noise. He lived in drawings and blueprints in the clean order of design, while outside his windows, the Weimar Republic seemed to crumble. That indifference to politics would not last. In 1931, while teaching at the Technical University, Speer was invited by one of his students to attend a meeting of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. He went without much expectation, but what he saw and heard would change the course of his life. The speaker that night was Joseph Goebbels, the party's propaganda chief, who spoke with fiery passion about Germany's humiliation and the promise of renewal under Adolf Hitler. Speer was impressed, not by the ideology of racial hatred, which at that point seemed secondary to him, but by the energy, the sense of momentum, the promise that here was a movement of action and purpose. 2 months later, on March 1st, 1931, he joined the Nazi Party. For a time, Speer's membership meant little more than occasional architectural jobs for local party offices. But in 1933, after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, Speer was asked to redesign the Nazi headquarters in Berlin. His work caught attention, and soon he was given larger assignments. That same year, he was summoned to meet Hitler himself. It was a meeting that would bind their fates. Hitler had always considered himself an artiste manqué, an architect at heart whose destiny had been denied by the rejection of art schools in Vienna. To find in Speer a young man who could give form to his own visions was electrifying. Speer, for his part, found himself captivated by the Führer's attention. In his later memoirs, he admitted that praise from Hitler felt like a drug, the highest reward imaginable. Their relationship quickly deepened. Speer designed the staging for the Nuremberg rally in 1934, creating the now famous Cathedral of Light, in which 130 anti-aircraft searchlights beamed into the night sky, enclosing the rally ground with towering shafts of light. The effect was mystical and overwhelming. It transformed mass politics into a kind of sacred spectacle. Hitler was thrilled, and from then on, Speer became his favored architect. He was tasked with designing projects of immense scale. The new Reich Chancellery in Berlin, completed in record time in 1939. Colossal plans to remake Berlin into Germania, the capital of a global empire, with avenues, arches, and halls so vast they would dwarf the monuments of Paris, London, and Rome. Through these projects, Speer rose swiftly in the hierarchy of the regime. Unlike other Nazi leaders, he was not a man of ideology. He rarely spoke of race or politics. His focus was on buildings, proportions, and the challenge of translating Hitler's fantasies into stone. This detachment made him seem apolitical, even harmless, but it also made him uniquely dangerous. By refusing to question the purpose his architecture served, he gave physical reality to a dictatorship. His designs were propaganda in stone, monuments meant to last 1,000 years. When war came in 1939, the grand construction project slowed, and the needs of the military became paramount. In 1942, the armaments minister Fritz Todt was killed in a plane crash, and Hitler moved swiftly to appoint Albert Speer as his successor. It was a stunning rise. At the age of only 36, Speer was placed in charge of supplying Germany's armies with weapons, ammunition, and equipment, one of the most powerful and critical roles in the Reich. Here too, Speer's organizational genius proved formidable. He applied methods of streamlining, centralizing production, eliminating inefficiencies, and increasing output. His reforms meant that even under the crushing weight of Allied bombing and the advance of enemy armies, German war production did not collapse. Instead, it increased. In 1944, with Germany on the verge of defeat, Speer's ministry produced more planes, tanks, and guns than ever before. Hitler called him his miracle man, the indispensable manager who kept the war machine running when all seemed lost. But this efficiency was built on suffering. To meet demands, Speer relied heavily on forced labor, millions of prisoners of war, civilians from occupied countries, and concentration camp inmates who worked in terrible conditions, often to death. Later, Speer would insist that he had little knowledge of the worst abuses, that he was too absorbed in technical matters to notice the brutality of the system. Yet evidence shows that he knew far more than he admitted. He visited factories, negotiated with SS leaders, and understood that the labor keeping his machine alive was supplied by camps where starvation, disease, and death were daily realities. In these years, Speer was at the peak of his power. He was no longer simply an architect. He was one of the central figures in the Nazi regime, a man who combined technical skill with administrative authority. His work prolonged the war, ensuring that Germany fought on long after defeat had become inevitable. For Hitler, this loyalty was invaluable. For history, it was devastating. By 1943, however, the tide of war had turned. German armies suffered catastrophic defeats at Stalingrad and in North Africa. The Allies bombed German cities relentlessly. The Reich that Speer and Hitler had envisioned as eternal began to crumble before their eyes. Yet even as collapse loomed, Speer continued to serve, struggling to balance his loyalty to Hitler with the grim reality that the war could not be won. And it is here, in the midst of that contradiction, loyalty and doubt, efficiency and destruction, vision and blindness, that Albert Speer's story moves into its darkest and most revealing chapter. In the final years of the Reich, he would find himself caught between the wreckage of Hitler's dreams and his own struggle to define who he was: an artist, a servant, or a criminal. By 1944, the bombing of German cities had reached catastrophic levels. Factories, homes, and infrastructure lay in ruins. Allied forces had landed in France and were advancing from the west, while Soviet armies were pushing relentlessly from the east toward Berlin. For Albert Speer, a new and troubling question arose. Should he remain loyal to Hitler until the very end, or should he acknowledge the undeniable truth that the war was lost? He knew the situation was beyond salvation, yet years of loyalty and the personal bond he had with Hitler kept him conflicted. Hitler still clung to his illusions. He believed in miracle weapons, in last-minute counterattacks, in the possibility of turning the tide. Speer no longer shared those fantasies, but he kept the factories working as long as possible. He ordered production moved underground, organized emergency systems, and tried to keep the war machine alive even as the Reich itself was collapsing. There are accounts that at one point, Speer even considered killing Hitler. He thought about releasing poison gas into the Führer's underground bunker ventilation system. It was a desperate idea born from despair and growing disillusionment. But in the end, he did nothing. His loyalty, his fear, or perhaps his inability to take such a decisive step kept him from acting. He remained by Hitler's side until the final weeks. As 1945 began, Germany was collapsing on every front. Cities were in flames, millions of civilians were fleeing, and the army was retreating everywhere. Hitler withdrew into his bunker in Berlin, increasingly isolated from reality. Speer visited him there several times, trying to reason with him, urging him to stop the destruction. For as defeat loomed, Hitler had issued the infamous scorched earth order. Everything of value in Germany, from factories to railroads, should be destroyed so that nothing would fall into enemy hands. Speer knew this would mean total devastation for the German people who were already suffering terribly. In a rare moment of defiance, he ignored Hitler's order. He sabotaged the destruction program, quietly instructing local commanders and engineers to disobey. In doing so, he may have spared Germany from complete ruin. When Berlin finally fell in May 1945, Speer was not inside the bunker for Hitler's suicide. He had distanced himself in the final days, but he was still deeply entangled in the machinery of the Reich. Captured by Allied forces, he was placed under arrest. His fate, like that of the other surviving Nazi leaders, would be decided at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. The Nuremberg trials began in late 1945, and for the first time, the world saw the surviving architects of the Nazi regime placed in the dock. There was Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, and many others. And among them, Albert Speer, the man who had built Hitler's dreams in stone and kept his armies armed until the very end. The charges were grave: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence against Speer was strong. His ministry had exploited millions of forced laborers under brutal conditions. His factories were linked to concentration camps. He had been a key figure in prolonging the war. And yet, unlike many of the other defendants, Speer adopted a different strategy. He admitted responsibility. He expressed remorse. He claimed that he had been blinded by his devotion to Hitler, that he had failed morally by not questioning the regime. His demeanor set him apart. While Göring boasted and raged, Speer spoke calmly and with apparent honesty. He admitted guilt not for specific atrocities, but for what he called his general responsibility. Many historians have argued that this self-presentation saved his life. In October 1946, the verdict was announced. While several of his colleagues were sentenced to death by hanging, Albert Speer was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was sent to Spandau prison in Berlin, where he served the full 2 decades. Those years behind bars became a strange second life for him. He spent his time reading, gardening, and above all, writing. He kept secret diaries, smuggling notes to the outside world through sympathetic wardens. Over the years, he crafted a narrative of himself as the repentant technocrat, the good Nazi, who had been seduced by Hitler but never truly part of the inner circle of crimes. When he was finally released in 1966, Speer emerged into a world utterly changed. He was one of the few high-ranking Nazis still alive, and there was immense public interest in his story. He published his memoirs, Inside the Third Reich, followed by Spandau, The Secret Diaries. These books became international bestsellers. They presented Speer as a man who admitted guilt, who condemned Hitler, and who tried to explain how an educated, cultured person like himself could be drawn into serving a dictatorship. Many readers were captivated. Here, it seemed, was a Nazi who was willing to confess, to analyze, to face his own mistakes. He was courted by journalists, historians, and television programs. To some, he appeared almost redeemed, but not everyone accepted this image. Critics pointed out that Speer's memoirs downplayed his role in slave labor, ignored his deeper complicity in the regime, and painted him in a far more sympathetic light than truth allowed. Evidence discovered later suggested that he had known much more about the Holocaust than he ever admitted. Documents and testimonies showed that he had been present at meetings where the use of concentration camp labor was discussed, and that his ministry was directly tied to the exploitation of Auschwitz and other camps. Thus, Albert Speer's legacy became one of contradiction. Was he the repentant technocrat who admitted his guilt and tried to learn from his crimes? Or was he a cunning manipulator who crafted an image of remorse to save himself from the gallows and rehabilitate his reputation? The debate has never fully ended. Speer lived quietly after his release, dividing his time between writing and giving interviews. He remained a figure both fascinating and controversial. On September 1st, 1981, during a visit to London, Albert Speer died of a stroke at the age of 76. His story endures because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. He was not a sadistic killer nor a fiery ideologue. He was a cultured man, an architect, an organizer, yet he became a pillar of one of history's most murderous regimes. His life raises questions about responsibility, about the dangers of ambition without conscience, about how ordinary talent can be corrupted when it serves evil ends. Albert Speer remains one of the most haunting figures of the Third Reich. He built the dreams of a dictator, prolonged the life of a doomed empire, and then sought forgiveness in the ruins. Whether history grants him that forgiveness is